Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the honor of serving as director of Roosevelt House. And it's a pleasure to welcome you on a non-rainy night. For those of you who were here last week for Bill Moyers, it's a nice change. Anyway, we are thrilled to welcome you to the home of Eleanor Roosevelt and her husband. That's that's going to be my line when we do Eleanor events here. And exciting to be in the throes of this new year in public programming, which reminds me to say to those of you who are observing, Happy New Year. And pivoting from Hubert Humphrey and civil rights, which we premiered last week, to another civil rights icon whom we know and love, Eleanor Roosevelt. I just want to give one special shout out tonight. This is a beautiful looking crowd. I'm thrilled to see all of you. We have one person watching on Zoom who I wanted to say hello to and tell you about. His name is Dave Bassnett. He is a recent graduate of Hunter College. He went through our public policy and human rights programs, and he became the second person in the history of Hunter College to win a Rhodes Scholarship. So, hi, Dave. He's from Nepal, and he created the American dream here with his parents and his sister, so we're so proud of him. So sometimes when we reminisce about the Roosevelt's history in this house, as I say, we tend to stress FDR. He did, after all, recover from polio here under Eleanor's care. He did return to politics in this house with Eleanor's help. Everybody, please look at your phones and turn them off. That's key because we don't want Dave to hear the phones from wherever, from Oxford or wherever. He did run for president from this house, again, with Eleanor's crucial help. And he did run the presidential transition of 1932-33 from his library 3 flights upstairs, with Eleanor urgently recommending that her husband name the first woman ever to serve in a presidential cabinet 90 years ago this year. Happily, it was her friend Frances Perkins who became one of the architects of the New Deal. So we like to remind our visitors, this is the house where Social Security was born under Frances's recommendation. So thank you, Franklin and Eleanor, for that. I'm going to be reminding people about other anniversaries through our programming here. This is an anniversary-rich year for us. It's the 75th anniversary of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which we will be observing in early December. And it's also the 80th anniversary of the handoff of this house, at which Franklin Roosevelt was scheduled to appear to give the deed of the house to Hunter College. Guess who showed up? Eleanor, right. And we meet just a couple of weeks short of Eleanor's 139th birthday, too. So we're going to devote tonight to a rather neglected but heroic role in her life and the life of the country she served. Her contributions to soldier morale, civilian confidence, and presidential briefing and understanding during World War II. Mainly, again, 80 years ago, her visit to the South Pacific, an effort she undertook with great sympathy to those who she would encounter and greater courage as well, and armed with a pretty good grasp of the strengths and challenges in the Pacific theater. As Admiral Nimitz said when she visited his headquarters in Hawaii, now I've met the brains of the Roosevelt family. Shannon McKenna Schmidt has delivered a sharp and dramatic account of that mission, which took Eleanor away from Washington for an unbelievable 5 consecutive weeks, 25,000 miles of travel, a trip one American newspaper called the most remarkable journey any president's wife has ever made, throughout which, if I'm correct, she continued to file My Day columns which she seldom missed. In one of them, she reported on a soldier whose wife was about to have a baby, another who was sent overseas just before he get married, an outdoor movie night, inevitable tours of hospitals, did a shout out for the editor of a camp newspaper, just matter-of-factly documenting this extraordinary thing she did. My favorite is where she writes that I've seen soldiers standing on watch, struggling with their outdoor fire and the new and difficult task of making gravy for pork chops. So rather than promote anxiety or hunger pains at home, she said this convinced her that every boy should learn to cook and live out in the open. That's our Eleanor. So we're looking forward to hearing more about this story from two extraordinary people. Shannon, whose biography, a full biography, is in your programs at your seats, has previously focused on literary figures and destinations. And these were quite some destinations, as you'll hear, specializing in books about their haunts and retreats, as well as their private lives. She's also written for National Geographic and other magazines, been heard on NPR, Morning Joe. I don't know if you ever got a word in on Morning Joe. I didn't, but that's okay. And many programs focusing on travel. So who more appropriate to discuss Eleanor's historic and exhausting sounding travel than Shannon, so welcome. To lead the conversation, we are thrilled, as always, to welcome back someone who has been a vital participant at Roosevelt House ever since I arrived here 8 years ago, and for time before that as well, Blanche Wiesen Cook. She's not only a fixture here, but the leading biographer of Eleanor Roosevelt, whose 3 volumes, acclaimed and best-selling 3 volumes, covered all phases of her life in magisterial style. And she's a Hunter alum. Class, may I say the class, please? Class of 1962. That's hard to believe. She was 4 years old when she graduated, a prodigy. And I believe met Eleanor face to face and many times. And not only knows her and has chronicled her, but sometimes channels her as well. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping things. I do urge you to look at and silence your phones because we are recording and taping this hopefully for broadcast on CUNY TV. Let me remind you, we'll have about 45 minutes of discussion followed by an audience Q&A, and we urge you to participate. And then we invite you upstairs, or will invite you upstairs, to the old dining rooms of the house. And here's a picture. Monica, I meant to cue it up. If you can show that picture. I've never shown this in the house. Here is Eleanor in the room that you'll be going to buy your books, to get them signed, and to have a glass of wine. She's in the foreground, presiding over a victory party for Al Smith, whom she supported over her own cousin, the son of Theodore Roosevelt, for governor of New York in 1924. Caused a bit of a rift in the family, but Al Smith won. So with that, and we can go back to our shot of the book we will be discussing, it's a pleasure to welcome Shannon McKenna Schmidt in conversation with Blanche Wiesen Cook.
Shannon, your book is incredible.
Well, thank you.
And I guess I have so many questions, but because there's so much new information in the book, and then you take us on her journey. I mean, I was looking at my book, and I talk about the impact of her journey and her wisdom that comes out of the journey, but I was a little bit surprised that I spent only 3 pages or something on the journey. And so you take us everywhere. And so talk about your journey. I mean, you're a National Geographic, reporter, and journeys are your thing, and you do the hikes. How'd you get into this, and What'd you get out of it? Tell us the story.
Well, actually, I was reading a collection of Eleanor's column, My Day. Harold mentioned My Day in the introduction. And there was just the briefest of mentions that she had visited Australia during a tour of the Pacific Theater in 1943. And like I said, fleeting mention, but immediately it piqued my interest because I had recently been to Australia and New Zealand. And the first thought that struck me was amazement at the distance that she would have traveled to get there and under wartime conditions. And I was hooked from the start. And then fairly early on, I came across something that she wrote in one of her autobiographies 6 years after the trip to the Pacific. And she said, "The Pacific trip left a mark from which I think I shall never be free." And I found that statement so powerful and so haunting, and that she said it so many years later. And that really compelled me to uncover what she experienced during those 5 weeks in the Pacific.
That's, she had, when she returned, after seeing so many wounded and hurt, service members, she had PTSD. And it really did change her life. And she talks about how the trip changed her life. And she becomes a great crusader for peace after that. I mean, she was a crusader for peace before that. But after that, I mean, we cannot go on having wars. We have to figure out new ways to see each other and deal with each other. And it was those 6 weeks and all she experienced. What were the highlights for you as you go from, Bora Bora to Guadalcanal to all the places to Brisbane?
Yeah, and this is a story that just kept drawing me back to dig deeper and deeper, follow any thread and layer that I could to find out what she experienced on her journey. And I think one of the highlights, for me in the story is talking about how she got to Guadalcanal. Because that was the ultimate goal of her trip, but it wasn't always, there was questionable about whether she was going to be able to go there. And also in the research process, there actually is a memoir written by one of the serviceman who was on the bomber crew that flew her into Guadalcanal. And I was having a really hard time getting my hands on this book. It was hard to even buy a copy. And so that was a little bit of detective work on my part to get my hands on that. And a very wonderful librarian at the Nimitz Library in Annapolis at the Air Force Academy, or Naval, thank you. She very kindly got me this chapter, and that was a key in talking about it, and of course Eleanor's recollections as well. It was the most thrilling moment of the trip for her. Of course, by this time she is 4.5 weeks into a 5-week trip, and she is exhausted. And it's the 2 hardest days leading up to when she gets to Guadalcanal. But she's Eleanor. She digs deep. She finds the stamina. It's the most thrilling time for her to be in this. She's sitting in the dark, freezing bomb bay of a heavily gunned Navy bomber. And she's elated that she's getting to Guadalcanal, which was her ultimate goal of the trip. And that to me was one of the peak moments in writing this book.
Great. Let me just say, there are so many incredible things in this book that I've never seen anywhere else. And one of them, you have the fact that Mayoress Cheney's San Francisco wedding was in the home of Dr. Margaret Chung, who is responsible for the Flying Tigers. And, where'd you find that?
Yeah, see, this is part of the reason so it took me actually from initial idea to turning in my final manuscript was 4 years. And part of the reason was because I just followed every single thread that I could, and something like that. So for the first 10 days, Eleanor, the trip was kept a secret for security reasons. And if the press had been on it, they would have known that she went to San Francisco first. She flew from New York to San Francisco. And she was there for the wedding of Mayoress Cheney, a friend of hers. And it was even reported in the newspapers that Mayoress Cheney and her fiance had applied for a wedding license, a marriage license, and were getting married. And I find it kind of funny that, you know, there were a couple of opportunities for the press maybe have known about this, and they didn't. And that was one of them. And yes, so Mayoress Cheney was married at the home of Dr. Margaret Chung, who was involved in, you know, World War II efforts. And yeah, newspaper databases, memoirs, Dr. Chung, there's biographies about her. Yeah, so just digging for any little grain that I could find and following any thread and seeing where it led.
Are there, I didn't know there were biographies of her.
Yes, there's
Yes.
at least one. Yeah.
Okay, great, because we don't know about her.
Right,
And she sounds
yes,
fantastic. I mean, and she has organized the
Mhm,
Flying
mhm,
Tigers,
Right.
who are so important over time. I guess the one criticism I do have a criticism, and that is your footnotes are not paginated. That it was driving me crazy.
Yes. So
And, you know,
That's funny.
you have words, but the
Yeah.
words I was looking up were not the words that you chose to
Yeah,
highlight.
yeah.
Why did you decide to do that?
Well, we made the decision editorially not to footnote within the text, because I find that distracting. It's narrative nonfiction. It's, you know, it's not, you know, hardcore whatever. It's narrative nonfiction, and I find that disruptive. However, I 100% agree with you. I wish that the footnotes had the corresponding page. That wasn't my decision.
Well, maybe for the
So,
paperback.
yes, I will. Yes, I'm actually with you on that, and I will relay that.
That's great. There are so many really stunning things. You have a section on Lyndon Baines Johnson and race at page 164. And here it is. There's a U.S. Army camp near Townsville. The ever-present shadow of racism led to a violent incident in 1942. After months of enduring racial taunts and abuse, black GIs were part of a labor battalion commanded by white officers, and the black GIs mutinied. And LBJ was asked for his thoughts by Robert Sherwood, a Time Life reporter, since it concerned LBJ, who was then a lieutenant commander in the Naval Reserve, and LBJ suppressed the report. What did you make of that, and what was their surrounding? I mean, this is LBJ. We think of him as the, you know, pioneering civil rights president.
Right. Yeah, probably not his decision to suppress this, you know, racial incident within the Army, and not the only thing that was suppressed during the war. And, you know, I always wondered if when Eleanor was in Townsville, if anyone told her about that incident. You know, I don't know. And this actually only came out, you know, not that long ago about this incident and the fact that it was suppressed. And a journalist tried to get out the truth about what happened. Something else that the military suppressed was you know, Eleanor traveled in a transport plane. and there was a very, Mackie, Australia was a rest area for servicemen, and a converted bomber to transport plane crashed with 41 men on board and killed 40 of them. And that was suppressed because of morale. So it wasn't unusual for, I think, things to be suppressed for morale reasons, or even in the case of race, other reasons.
I guess I was just surprised that LBJ,
That LBJ did it,
yeah,
right.
that he did it,
Yes.
because that
Hmm.
it doesn't feel like what he usually. What were the most surprising things for you?
Well, one of the most surprising things for me is that Eleanor wanted to be a pilot herself. And I loved that. And she was friends with Amelia Earhart. FDR didn't ask her to hold back on too many things, but that one he did say, hey, I got a lot of worries. I'm about to be president. Maybe you could not go fly a plane. And so that was one of the things that surprised me. And she was an early advocate of commercial air travel, which I also think is really neat. And she took her first flight in 1929. And that's another little nugget that I tracked down thanks to newspaper databases. And I said, I have to be able to find out when she took her first flight. And I just did a deep dive into the newspaper databases, tried all these keywords. And it turns out that she took her first flight in 1929 when she was First Lady of New York State. And she was asked to christen a research plane for an aeronautical instruments company. And she said she would do it on one condition. No flight, no christening. And she took a 20-minute ride in the skies over Albany that day.
That's great. That's really great. There are things that happen because of this journey. The GI Bill happens because when Eleanor Roosevelt returns, she says to Franklin, we have to have a situation that is completely different. The GIs need to be compensated for their time and for their hurt and for their wounds and for their medical conditions. And the GI Bill does actually happen on the 27th of October, 1943. There's another, all of the while, Eleanor Roosevelt is on this trip. She is also writing a book that becomes the moral basis of democracy. And again, if you will bear with me, I would like to read from that book because it really becomes her creed. And it is at this moment when we're facing so much hideous reality, our creed. And she writes, the 130 million people who make up our great nation come from every nation on the globe. Asians, Africans, Europeans, Latin Americans. We are the melting pot of the world. We now face almost an entire continent of vast resources, but we have allowed a situation to arise where many people are debased by poverty or the accident of race in our own country and therefore have no stake in democracy, while others appeal to this old rule of the sacredness of property rights in the hands of a limited number. The fruits of the labor of many are ignored. Today, issues of economic opportunity and security define our problems. It is often said we are free, and then sneeringly free to starve. This is not an amusement. Nobody can say, quote, Indians or Negroes of this country are free. Racial prejudice enslaves. Poverty enslaves. And it goes on. Political democracy requires economic democracy while greed debases it. And then she goes on wonderful attack on greed. And it is really her trip to the Pacific that intensified her very long commitment to the changes that needed to occur. Your thoughts?
Yes, no, absolutely. It's a great point. And, part of what made her even more determined to work for peace was seeing all of these young men wounded in body and mind. And she said that one sees the results of war in the hospitals. And in that regard, there probably aren't too many people who saw more than she did. And she was a class act going through the hospital wards and offering words of comfort or a joke. But she says how she burned inside with resentment at what was being done to this generation of young men. And yes, this trip absolutely reinforced her determination to work for peace. And when she was in Rockhampton, Australia, the mayor there said, "We would like to see you at the peace table." And then because of circumstances, that actually ends up coming true.
It does. There's one scene in Australia where she's at a Negro canteen, a black GI canteen, and she takes a bite out of the ice cream that a black soldier is eating. And she takes the cone and she bites it and she hands it back and she says, "Now that didn't hurt very much, did it?" Did you come across that?
I did, yes, yes. And, and that was a contrast. So Eleanor did a trip the year before to Great Britain, and the Secretary of War, he asked FDR to ask Eleanor not to talk about race because the black U.S. servicemen were being treated well in England,
London.
and they didn't want to create any, brouhaha within the armed services or whatever. So she does not talk about race while she's in Great Britain. In the Pacific, she does talk about race, and I think she goes out of her way to make examples like this and to speak with black servicemen, to speak with black journalists who were also there covering this trip. And she gives, before she leaves Australia, she gives a speech, and she she pointedly mentions race.
Yeah. And it really changes the story ultimately. She comes back and she works for peace and she works for civil rights with a new and incredible intensity. And so 7 years? 4 years? You're working on this
4.
book 4 years.
Yes.
Some of my books take 10 years, so
Mine's shorter.
it is. But it's intense. So how has it changed your perspective?
It's changed my perspective. I think I didn't know a whole lot about the war in the Pacific. I didn't know a whole lot about jungle warfare, and really eye-opening about what we put these men through and what we asked of them. I'm getting a little teary-eyed just talking about it, and there were many times when, I cried writing this book. And so I can only imagine, what Eleanor must have felt in that intensity, and she connected with the servicemen on an individual level. And Admiral Halsey, commander of the South Pacific Forces, is the man who would decide whether she went to Guadalcanal, and he was dead set against her trip. And one of the reasons that he ultimately changed his mind was because he could see that she was the real deal. And here's this rough, gruff, tough admiral, and he said that one of the things that what he marveled at most was the expressions on the men's faces as she leaned over them in their hospital beds. And to me, that was just very telling, and really seeing these servicemen as individuals and caring about them on an individual level like she did. And she really went to great lengths to understand jungle warfare and what it entailed and what they were experiencing. And, a lot of that she did relay back to the American public. Oh, another thing that surprised me is how forthright she was with the American public. I loved it. Like she would give them a slap if she thought they needed it. She gave them the what for. And when she came back, she was giving a speech on the radio, and she told them about the servicemen that she met. There was a young man that she met in a first-line hospital who was so recently injured that he was still in the set of bandages from when he fell in battle. She told people to stop complaining about food rationing and shortages because it was nothing compared to lying on your back in a jungle swamp while an enemy camouflaged in the trees took shots at you. And she told them about the shadowed eyes of the men who had endured jungle warfare. And so I found that all very impactful for me. You know, and also my grandfather served in the Pacific. In the Philippines and New Guinea. So that really impacted me in a great way, finding out what they went through.
Well, it's really a wonderful book, and it's filled with incredible vision, you know, really vital, visional, dramatic travel and words. And Eleanor Roosevelt was amazing. And when she came back, on her agenda was peace, human rights, and then when Truman appoints her to the UN, there's no question in her mind that we're going to have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because that will avoid war in the future. If everybody has the kind of not only political but economic human rights, a job, education, security, dignity, everybody, everywhere, we will have peace. And since this is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we should all be talking about it and celebrating it. I'm a little astonished that it hasn't really been part of the news reality, but absolutely, this trip impacted her life. She spoke to everybody. She spent hours and hours and hours talking individually to thousands of servicemen in hospitals, in camps, in all of these extraordinary places which you know, vividly describe. It's a great book. So I'm going to open it to your thoughts and comments. Okay, I will. With your mic, too. One little footnote to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that India's delegate, Hansa Mehta, laid the unfinished ethical agenda of our time before the world. And Hansa Mehta, who was president of the All India Women's Conference and leader of the independence movement, and the only other woman on the commission, significantly transformed the document. And she doesn't get enough credit, but it was Hansa Mehta who said, Eleanor, you have all men. It has to say all human beings. And that is what it says. So all human beings have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
I wanted to ask you if you thought there was any political motivation. I guess we now know that FDR was planning to run for an unprecedented fourth term, and we know that the Southern Democrats did not like Eleanor's civil rights positions, and they're a key part of the Democratic coalition. Were there political considerations behind the trip, since Franklin and Eleanor were both very political people? And if so, was it helpful in quelling the Eleanor haters?
So I think that first and foremost, this was not this was a humanitarian mission for Eleanor, and she didn't have to make this trip, and so I think it was personal for her. But of course, politics are always there. And in fact, when she was in Bora Bora, she got up at dawn to breakfast with servicemen, and she was sitting with a table of enlisted men, and they're all tongue-tied because they're with Eleanor Roosevelt. And one brave GI spoke up finally and asked if FDR was going to run again for a fourth term. And Eleanor didn't have an answer, but it broke the ice. So I think we couldn't escape politics. And another tidbit I came across is that the Alabama governor, while Eleanor was in the Pacific, announced that he was going to denounce her at the forthcoming Democratic National Convention and push a platform of white supremacy. And also, once news broke about the trip, it was kept secret for the first 10 days. Once news broke, there was just a media deluge. And of course, all of the detractors of the Roosevelt administration and people attacking Eleanor personally all came out, griping about various things. So while I don't think she made this trip for political reasons, you couldn't escape politics surrounding it.
And there was a lot of negative reaction. I mean, when she rubs noses.
Right.
You want to say something about that?
Yes, well,
Really?
yes. Her detractors blasted a lot of things, whether she had the right to wear a Red Cross uniform, which she absolutely did. The use of fuel, they were saying that she just wanted to make money for her, write columns, when in fact she was donating the money and she paid for the trip herself. Racists, as Blanche just mentioned, got all riled up because when she was at the home of the Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand, she received a traditional Maori greeting, which is a pressing of the noses, which is akin to shaking hands. And that, a congressman ranted, on the floor and of the House, and yeah, so there was a lot of criticism, which Eleanor was used to at this point. But yes, it just, because that spotlight was very intense during her trip to the Pacific. She already had a great media spotlight, but this magnified everything.
Yes.
My name is Irving Lee. I was wondering whether Eleanor saw eye to eye with FDR's perspective towards the British Empire with the Atlantic Charter, and whether or not she was advocating that position and ultimately advocating FDR's position on the Bill of Rights, for example, in those last years. And what was her perspective of Henry Wallace being removed from the slate back in 1944? And the other question is the race question.
I don't know, Glenn. Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
No, totally fine. It's just my avenue of research didn't take me down some of those avenues, so I don't know if, Blanche, if you
I'm
have
not
anything
sure.
to say.
I'm not sure what you mean by her reaction to Wallace being removed. Well, she supported Wallace and quoted him. It was no big deal. She basically believed that all of FDR's compromises to keep, to keep the Dixiecrats in his camp so there wouldn't be a breach, that all of his compromises would be healed over time. And she had great faith that they were on the same page and were absolutely in agreement about what was needed ultimately. I don't know if that answers your question, but that was.
And you mentioned the GI, was it the GI Bill of Rights that you were, yeah.
Yes, she absolutely. I mean, the GI Bill of Rights was FDR's gift to her. You will be happy with what goes on tomorrow, he says to her. And she's waiting to hear the announcement on the radio, and she's delighted. And her friends call her and say, congratulations. Yes. Yes. Introduce yourself, please.
You know me.
Yes, I know you, but everybody else.
My name is Trudy Mason, and I do politics.
Yes.
Anyway.
Trudy Mason is one of our leading politicians.
anyway, and an old friend of Blanche. And I would suggest to you that you read the second volume of well, you should read all 3 volumes, but to answer your question, you should read the second volume of Blanche's book. You'll get the you'll get the answers. I'll play PR person for you for a second.
Thank you.
But I do have a question, two questions, well, they're related. First of all, how was were there any women who accompanied her on this trip? Or did she meet with women as she went through the Pacific Theater? And also, how were they able, you said that for the first 10 days of the trip, it was totally, the media didn't know it. How were they able to keep this from the media? Because the First Lady just doesn't disappear in the middle of wartime, so.
Yeah, well, two excellent points. I'll talk about the secrecy first. So it was kept secret the first 10 days. So she left Hyde Park, came here to New York City. She was kind of, tried to keep things on the down low. She took a commercial flight from New York to San Francisco, which that in and of itself wouldn't raise eyebrows because she routinely took flights. And there was some speculation in newsrooms about why she didn't accompany FDR to a World Leaders Conference in Quebec, but no reporters really delved any deeper. And the other thing that she did was she used My Day. So she pre-wrote columns, and the byline listed her location as being in Hyde Park. So she helped use My Day to keep the subterfuge. And I love that. So in the first day or two, I think it might even be the exact day that she's leaving on her flight to San Francisco. She reveals in My Day that she and FDR had been at Hyde Park entertaining Prime Minister Churchill. And so I feel like, she's definitely using My Day. So she's kind of like, the media didn't know that because that was also kept secret. So she's kind of revealing this thing over here, and she's hopping on a flight over there. And then we did mention that there was an opportunity for the media in San Francisco with her attending this wedding that was announced a couple days before, and that it was actually announced in the newspaper that she was a friend of the bride, Maris Cheney. But again, no reporters delved any deeper. And then that night around midnight, she was on the transport plane headed to the Pacific. And in terms of women, so Eleanor, this was the first time that she traveled without a family member, a friend, or her longtime personal secretary and friend, Tommy Thompson, traveling with her, because she wanted to cut down on criticism, so she didn't take anybody with her. And so, sorry, did you?
Yeah, she also wanted to travel alone. It was something she always wanted to do, to take a trip all by herself. And this was the first time she was able to do that.
And so you asked about women. So one of the reasons that she was making this trip was to see the war work that women in Australia and New Zealand were doing, and she was specifically invited there to do that. So she did do a lot of that. She saw women in factories. She saw women in the armed forces in Australia. And one of the... Yes, and one of the anecdotes that I love is that she spent what she said was a very happy half hour with U.S. Army and Navy nurses who told her about their experiences in New Guinea, where they were fairly close to they weren't in the battle zone, but they were close enough that they could get air evacuees. So they were pretty close. And Eleanor, she also said that if she could be anything, she would like to have been a nurse in the Army or the Navy because they most closely shared the men's experiences.
Yes.
Why Guadalcanal?
Another excellent question. Guadalcanal was the site of the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific War. And Eleanor felt that visiting there was a tribute that she owed to the men in uniform, to see where so many of them had died or received their injuries. And she had already met a lot of men who had been wounded on Guadalcanal during hospital visits in the United States as well as in the Pacific. And it was very important to her to get there. And it was very important to her personally as well. It was also a personal test of courage for her. And she told FDR that she was afraid that she would be perceived as lacking courage if she wasn't allowed to go, and that she would never be able to face the men in the hospitals again.
So Shannon, I have a question.
Yes.
I'm amazed that no one has remarked on the dazzling cover of this book. You could not have crystallized the war experience any better, or the photographer could not have, with then showing a downed plane. Do you know anything about this kind of comical matchup of the diminutive soldier and the 6-foot Eleanor? And then I think, tell us a little bit more, I know you alluded briefly to it, about why she was entitled to wear the Red Cross uniform, which she wore throughout.
Well, as far as the difference in their heights, I don't know. It's sandy there. I don't
It's
know.
a little
may-
bit of a
yes,
slope.
Maybe there was, maybe the ground. I don't know. I don't know.
He's a short guy.
He's a short guy. Eleanor was a great supporter of the Red Cross, and she had volunteered for the Red Cross in World War I, and it was a very pivotal experience for her. And when she knew about the trip to the Pacific, she went and talked to Norman Davis, the head of the Red Cross, and she said, I'll inspect facilities for you while I'm in the region. And he said, great, I was planning to send somebody anyway, so this is perfect. He invited her to wear the uniform. And I think she felt comfortable wearing the uniform. This is all she wore during the whole trip. She only packed the Red Cross uniforms. She even wore the Red Cross uniform to diplomatic functions in Australia and New Zealand. And it partly helped her pare down. She had to adhere to a strict luggage limit, just like anybody else did. And just wearing the uniforms helped her pare down her clothing, because she took a manual typewriter with her to the Pacific, a heavy typewriter, so that she could keep writing My Day in real time. So we also have the First Lady of the United States reporting to the President and the home front in real time, which is pretty extraordinary. The other reason she wanted to wear the uniform was she felt it would armor her with another layer of validity for being in the Pacific, to be inspecting their facilities, and maybe cut down on some of the inevitable criticism. And she also felt it was a reassuring sight, the Red Cross insignia for the servicemen.
Yes.
Did any factors, Marshall-wise, did any factors in her marriage with problems with her husband motivate her to take this trip?
So they more or less decided together that she would do this trip, and FDR was enormously supportive of her travels from day one. I believe that he knew she needed it personally, and it also benefited him and his policy advisors, all of the information that she gathered while she was visiting communities across the country or wherever she was. And the other thing that I found very touching while I was researching this is she and FDR cabled each other every few days while she was in the Pacific. And the notes are very affectionate and loving, and they're checking on each other's health, and they're asking about family members, and they're making plans to see each other as soon as she returns. And her travels were really a touchstone for them as a couple, because they would get together and talk about her travels, like just the two of them, after she got back from her trips. And there's something that I love. When she was in Great Britain the year before, there was some discussion, high-level U.S. to British government discussions about how to send her home and how to safely send her home. And FDR was finally like, I don't care how you send her home, just send her home. And
Send her home safely.
Send her home safely. And when the plane was coming in over Washington, D.C., she could see that there was a big hoopla down on the tarmac, and with the Secret Service and FDR. And she saw that he had taken time out of his schedule to come and meet her at the airport when she landed.
And I think he really encouraged all of her trips around the U.S., because she brought information back. So he encouraged all of her trips. He knew that she would speak to people the way nobody else could and get information the way nobody else would. So he was really, she wanted to travel, and he wanted her to travel too.
And travel was one of the reasons that she was considered an unconventional first lady. Traditionally, first ladies stayed close to the White House. They didn't, travel. They oversaw social functions primarily. And also to have a woman in the 1930s and 40s traveling on her own was unusual.
One more question? Yes, in the back.
Yes, I'm Glenn Spear, and I heard you speak at
Oh,
Bryant Park.
yes, hi, I
And I
remember
enjoyed
you.
it so much, I came back
Oh,
tonight.
thank you.
So I was curious to ask you, of course, she had her column, and what kind of relationship did she have with the war correspondents? I know part of the trip was low-key, but did she get on with them? Was she one of the guys, so to speak, because she had her column? And also, say, in Guadalcanal or elsewhere, did she seek out and meet any of the indigenous people at all? Any of the islanders, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, I'm not sure if she specifically sought out any of the indigenous people of Guadalcanal. She was there for less than 24 hours, and she had a really brisk pace that she kept while she was there.
But
Oh,
but
sorry,
she did.
sorry, yes.
Yeah.
The war correspondent. I didn't come across anything of her like, hanging out with other war correspondents or anything. But the one thing is that she did have to adhere to censorship rules just like any other journalist. And they were voluntary, but largely adhered to in the US, but in the Pacific Theater, they were compulsory. So all of her My Day columns and stuff would have gone through military censors in the Pacific before they could be released. She couldn't name and print all of the islands that she visited. She couldn't reveal, say, the number of troops stationed at bases, any information that could aid the enemy. So just like any other journalist, she had to adhere to those same wartime restrictions. And they tried, and when she was in England and transmitted a column, she mentioned a secret place. And the censors tried to get in touch with her to say, can we change your column? And eventually they had to just go ahead and change it anyway, because they said, we can't catch up with her, she moves too fast.
Could I just
Yes.
ask one quick final question?
Yes.
When they finally alerted the press after the 10 days, I'm Gina Polaro, by the way, how did they do that? And what was the response?
That's a great question as well. So they had always planned when she reached New Zealand or Australia, whichever she went to first, and she reached New Zealand first, and they planned for news to break when she was there. So when she landed in Auckland, there was a whole contingent of reporters. But what's funny is that when she landed in New Zealand, it was the afternoon. It was nighttime in Washington, D.C., and the switchboard at the White House began lighting up as reporters scrambled for the story. And there wasn't so much surprise that Eleanor turned up on the other side of the world, but that it had been such a well-kept secret.
We have time for one more question or comment. Yes.
My name is Peter. I have a comment rather than a question at this point. Having read the book and listened to this evening and thought much about Eleanor, I'm reminded that there was a day in this country when we had heroes or heroines, when we had leaders who had courage to stand up and do things that were right, when we perhaps didn't all acknowledge it at that time, those times, the folks who were here then. Maybe we don't acknowledge it all today. But one of my personal laments is that we do not have the kind of moral leadership available in our country today, in my opinion, that she was able to show us all those years ago. Thank you very much.
And just to add a comment to your comment, that's one of the things that strikes me about Eleanor Roosevelt, is that she didn't have to do any of the things that she did, and she did it because she cared about people and to make life better for people.
And she really understood. Wendell Willkie said it one way, we are all one world. Eleanor Roosevelt said it another way, all human beings are connected. We are one people. And that was how she went forward. And the trip instigated that.